Welcome to this lecture on Gerald of Wales, parts 1 and 2, which you read for this segment of the class. This lecture is entitled Miracles, Not Miracles, and More Miracles. And what we're going to be doing today is drilling down into Gerald's text to think about this world that he set up, both in terms of margins and centers, which is a familiar paradigm to you already, but a couple of others. Let's first revisit the notion of margins and centers just to get us all on the same page. So recall what I said about centers and margins on the Mappa Mundi. You looked at the Hereford Mappa Mundi for last week. We have got strange creatures in the margins of that map and on many Mappa Mundi, and Jerusalem is there as like a gear or a wheel in the very center of the map. Yet Eden and quote-unquote Christ in Majesty are in the top margin, the easternmost part of the map. Jerusalem is in the center of many Mappa Mundi, and indeed that earlier TO map that I talked about a few lectures ago, precisely because it is so extraordinary. So dare I say that it's marginal and exceptional, but in a good way, as this mosaic that's the top of a church ceiling suggests Civitatis Dei, city of God. So that refers to the church in a more invisible way, more broadly, just like God's people. But yeah, Jerusalem is a conceit for that idea of like a physical place on earth that represents heaven. And as I said, in some of your comments online, yeah, cathedrals took on this bit of imagery as well, in that they were super duper tall and they were full of light thanks to the stained glass. So they were physical representations of heaven on earth, like in building form. Jerusalem had that symbolic resonance throughout the Middle Ages. So what are we to make of England's position on the margins? As I said in last lecture, they thought of themselves as exceptional, but in a good way. So a convenient crib for that idea is that Pope Gregory made a special effort to convert them, to go all the way, quote unquote, to the edge of the map, to convert those who were not angles but angels. So let's have a closer look at this map that dates from the mid 14th century. So there we have Jerusalem in the center. There we have Rome, and I'm going to home in on the next slide so you can see Rome a little bit more clearly. You can see that it looks like an enormous church, which is appropriate given its significance at the time. And where is England? So on the one hand, it's on the margins, yet it is very colorful. It stands out. It for sure isn't marginal in the sense of being squeezed out and liminal and unimportant. There it is, this big red circle there on the margins, and as you can see, it's populated with a lot of particular local places that we'll look at on the next slide. Here's a closer look at that Ramsey Abbey map made in England in the mid 14th century. So let me advertise for the British Library, which has so many free resources available to the public, and the images are very, very, very clear. Manuscripts that you've heard of, such as the Beowulf manuscript, you can even get in there with many of them and turn the pages and have a close look at them. So it really is marvelous. So I just cribbed what they had on their webpage, and will point to ideas as they relate to the map. It says the semi-red circle at the bottom of the map represents England, with Wales as a sliver below it. So as we know, these aren't geographically represented in an accurate way, so because of course Wales is part of that landmass that includes England. Here it looks like a separate island. There is text about Ireland in the large rectangular panel at the bottom, so not a landmass, but yet it's represented. And once again, these maps don't show accurate representations. They show ideological or symbolic, allegorical representations. I didn't drill down into this map of England there in the red semicircle, but you can see that there are several local places identified. So the British Library lists a few of them: London, Canterbury, Exeter, Bristol, Gloucester, Worcester, Nottingham, York, Durham, Lincoln, and Stamford, with Cornwall named as though it were a town. So Cornwall is a region in England. So yeah, we're still on the margins, but yet England does look very important for the amount of detail and the use of color on this map. So turning to Gerald, let's consider his mission. Let's think about some of the context under which Gerald comes to write his travel narrative. As I said, this is the second time that he's visited Ireland. The first time was 1183. It's now 1185. He's now on a royal mission for the English King Henry II. And if you know your history, this is the king who famously locked horns with Thomas Becket and said, "Who will rid me of that meddlesome priest?" Because they got into a rather complicated quarrel, and Becket was martyred in the Canterbury Cathedral in the year 1170. So this is a stone's throw away from that event. Gerald portrays his travel narrative as being itself a souvenir. So the page number that suggests that I took this small quote from your text. He says, rather than some small pieces of gold, falcons, or hawks with which the island abounds. So yeah, a little bit of possession there in this narrative, and I dare say, as you now know from reading the text, like the narrative of conquest is saturated in Gerald's observations of Ireland. Furthermore, Gerald, so yeah, I'm not making this up. I mean, this narrative of conquest is indeed, rather determinate and heavy-handed. The king's son John is along with him on this trip, so for thinking this is a not just a survey of the country, not just a neutral report, but rather a mission to gain control over the territory and claim it. Yeah, there's no further proof needed other than Gerald bringing the king's son, who's also the future king, along with him. So yeah, recall a little bit of recent history that Ireland has been handed over to the English for their safekeeping in the year 1154, so just a couple of decades before that, because the Irish allegedly, quote unquote, are wild, largely in part because of their geographic location, and becomes a convenient alibi for characterizing them as such. So if the English are dislocated from the rest of continental Europe and thus insular and out there, what to do with the Irish, who are even more quote unquote out there? Let's think about what Gerald is up against as he composes this travel narrative, mostly comprised of observations about the natural world. He doesn't talk to many live people, at least as he records it. He probably gets some of the legends encoded in the story from local people, but he says a lot about the political status of Ireland, and most of it is encoded in his observations of the natural world. So he's got to see what the king wants him to see while he's over there. He has to characterize Ireland as needful of such safekeeping that the English have over this island. Thus, he has to make it sound marginal. But different than England's marginality, which is good and exceptional, and as I've suggested, suggest the narrative of Christ's salvation of the one lost sheep, that he makes a special trip. The shepherd should make a special trip to save that one sheep that's wandered away. Ireland has to seem out there. So their marginality has to seem bad. Yet he can't overdo it and make them sound too morally corrupt, or the natural landscape you're too crazy, unruly, as I say there, unpalatable. He still has to make it sound like a tasty addition to England's realm. So he has to make it sound like this place has a lot to recommend it and that it's prime and ready for English possession. So really a tall order. So making it sound pathetic in many ways, but not so pathetic that, the king in theory would say, not so much, not for me. Gerald is certainly aware of this distinction between center and margins, uh, and as you read the text, you probably noticed that. But I'm going to suggest that we pay attention to a few others in this text, and in fact, the one between center and margins is part of a larger uh, paradigm, let's say a decoder ring, by which in Western culture we think about our world and our literature and our cultures. So these are probably familiar to you, even if you haven't thought about, um, this topic in such scholastic terms. So binary distinctions that create categories is what we're talking about. So we were thinking, gee, what constitutes the center versus the margins, both on the Hereford map as well as the Game of Thrones world. Let's think about a few others. So man and woman, good and evil, right and left. And as you think of others, you'll find, as I say here, that one term is privileged over the other. So, for example, usually when you read a text or you're even living a situation in your own lives, the traditional paradigm doesn't include man and woman, so it's more like man then woman. So one term is privileged over the other. So whether it's white people versus people of color, one term is traditionally privileged, and of course that's not coming from me as if that's correct that happens, but that's just the way the mind works. It's like, well, if you have two terms, one goes into one column, one goes into another, and one is quote unquote privileged over the other. So if you think of good and evil, even right and left, it's like, well, a lot of people are right-handed, but then left-handedness, we have an idea, oh yeah, that idea comes out of left field. And the word for left in Latin was sinister. So yeah, the present day English word is sinister. So I don't know that we have that association so much today, but yeah, just something so simple as the opposite of the direction right had a less good association attached to it. So it was kind of quote unquote subjugated to the more dominant term. Yeah, one that's problematic. So these paradigms are so fun to think about because they do fall apart so easily. The privileging is not always obvious or inherent. So what about young versus old? So on the one hand, who doesn't want to look younger and be younger? As they say, getting old isn't for sissies, so there's a lot of beauty products on the market to make people look younger, so the packaging says. But then, being old has an association with getting wise, and youth culture is often critiqued by older generations that, oh, young people these days, they're so terrible. Back in the day when I was growing up, people didn't behave that way. These young people are so disrespectful. So in that sense, we've got, old is privileged over young, and being young is quote unquote bad. In literary analysis, it's fun to think about how untidy these categories are. So both in terms of, how can we flip the paradigm and, let's say, have woman as superior to man. Let's say another example of this is the young versus old. It's like, gee, well, there's a tension there, like which one is privileged, or there's like a middle ground between the categories. So we see this problematized in terms of gender today, both in our political and popular cultures. There's an emergence of the word they as the singular form to designate like a gender neutral term for people who don't want to identify as male or female. So I think that grammatical point fits with this, in between status between the two, quote unquote traditional categories. Two key binaries that I'm going to think about vis-a-vis Gerald of Wales's text are nature versus culture and miracles versus magic. And the way that I put each of those terms here, I think I privileged the quote unquote like more dominant term, but as we can see, especially with nature and culture, that relationship gets problematized in many texts. Let's just first figure out how the binary works. So I'm going to think about nature versus culture for a fair bit of time. So let me give you an example. So a blueberry is natural. I could go and pick one off of a tree or a bush, but a blueberry muffin is a cultural product. Or if I dried those blueberries and coated them in sugar and I have to buy them at the store that way and said, oh, here's some dried blueberries, and they'd be super duper delicious, but loaded with sugar. Is that my fruit quota for the day? Did I get my blueberries? Well, technically yes, sort of no. I got like a blueberry product. But even this neat category falls apart. So the blueberry picked, fresh out of God's creation versus some kind of blueberry product, the blueberry muffin. The blueberries that I buy in the store are cultural products in that they've been picked and washed and packaged. I'm probably not picking them myself, and even if I am, I may have used pesticides in order that they are not eaten up by animals before I get to eat them. And with some fruits, good to go to the produce aisle of the store. It's the best part of any grocery store. But many of these things, you have to take them home first and scrub the heck out of them because they're covered with polish to look more appealing. So yes, they're natural things, but they've been primed for the marketplace, a cultural space. So where do these blueberries fit on the nature versus cultural dichotomy? The way the dichotomy is constructed is that nature includes entities in some kind of unadulterated state that, spoiler alert, is really hard to maintain, much less think about. Culture pertains to entities that are influenced by civilization. So by civilization, I don't always mean high culture. It's just anything that isn't natural and has some sort of artificial element to it. Let's think about how these categories shake out in Game of Thrones. I came up with a few examples to populate each of the categories. So for the natural world, Beyond the Wall and the Dothraki. The cultural world, we have King's Landing and the quote-unquote incest twins, that romantic couple. Yeah, the area beyond the wall is unknown, it's wild, it's untamed, it's threatening. Yeah, indeed, we don't know what's there just yet. But I hate to get technical, but it is beyond the wall because of the wall. So the wall is an artificial structure that's put up, whether it's for protection or whether it's just people, they don't really need it and it's an imagined threat. Nonetheless, if we moved that wall a little bit down, some people like Cersei Lannister might be happy because she doesn't like the Starks. She thinks that they are wild, uncivilized, a bit rough around the edges. And yeah, the North is so, but yeah, those people are one of the major royal houses on the show. So the wall itself is a quote-unquote construct. So yes, it does seem like there's after you get beyond the wall, it's a bit of a game changer that there's something else going on beyond there. I'm not disputing that, but indeed, where do we draw that wall that separates wilderness from civilization? Then we have the Dothraki, so they are nomadic, but they do have cultural codes. So yes, they don't live in houses like people do in King's Landing. They kind of quote unquote rough it, but as we will learn vis-a-vis Dany's experiences from having married Khal Drogo, yeah, they do have cultural codes and rules, and so even if they seem strange to us, strange to her, strange to other people on the show in this civilization, they still do have codes. So you think even if those codes make the culture kind of wild and rough, aren't they still codes? King's Landing, so definitely its culture is different from the North. So if we look at, for example, the architecture of King's Landing, it definitely seems very different from, let's say, the North, which seems wilder, and even quote unquote what's beyond the wall or other wild spaces that were shown on the show. And another example, like kind of a fraught example, we have Cersei and Jaime Lannister, who are in a romantic relationship. So they aren't married per se, but kind of like a marriage, they have chosen each other as their life partners. I'd like to think about how two of those examples suggest how the categories between nature and culture get inextricably wedded and mixed up. So we've got King's Landing. Its culture is going to be different from the North's because of the weather. So that's a natural distinction. It's a natural distinction that one is south and one is north. And sure, the architecture looks different. That's a cultural facet of civilization. Even the clothing too. I mentioned that up in the north they wear a lot of animal pelts. They're not going to wear those in the south. They'd get too hot. So okay, we will allow them that it's because of a natural phenomenon that the culture is going to be different. So the South just seems a little bit more sunlit, and it seems like they've got more of a front porch sort of culture that I find here in the South. We also have a lot of my neighbors like to sit on their front porches, and I'm not used to that growing up elsewhere in the country. But think about how the people are described in the show. So it's not just like, oh, they are from the North, they are from the kingdom of the Starks. It's like they're of the North, as if it's in their bones, and it makes them a certain way. So I can think with some of the Starks that it makes them wild, right? So I remember Cersei and Cat Stark talking at that feast, and Cersei's kind of trying to suss out what Cat Stark's deal is because she's been living in the North so long. So she herself is from the South. So that conversation, I think, would be interesting to analyze in terms of this nature versus culture distinction. So looking at the incest twins, of course, they've opted into this romantic relationship. So something like marriage would be quote unquote a cultural construct. But Cersei will reverse engineer this relationship all the way back to the womb. So she will say that it's because they quote unquote shared a womb together. We belong together. So it's kind of like, okay, from our very origins we were together, and that now mandates that we should have this something like a marriage. They can't be married because they're brother and sister, but have this romantic relationship. So this is Cersei's narcissism, I think, and I do love Cersei. I'll just put my cards on the table. But this is her narcissism that she's projecting onto the situation, and so that she can maintain her family's bloodline. By saying, because this natural fact, she's going to interpret it through a cultural lens. That is her desire for the throne. If you'd like a modern day crib for this idea, I'm sure that you young people are familiar with the quote unquote Like a Girl ad campaign that aired during one of the Super Bowls recently. And what it was trying to do is unpack, I pose it there in this question, how much of female nature, many things, whether it's girls aren't good at science, girls are more passive than boys, girls just want to be complimented on their physical looks, how much of that is inherent to women and how much of it is culturally ascribed to them after the fact, and so the natural facts get interpreted in terms of your cultural desires. So yeah, let's say girls, I don't have the hard data here, but girls, a whole bunch of girls, they scored less well on a math test. It's like, oh well, that seems to incontrovertibly prove that the girls were less good at math than the boys. But in fact, maybe they weren't encouraged to study the math. Maybe the boys had more resources. So that's a really general but familiar example. What we might say about that example is that the girls, let's say that women just want to be complimented on their looks. This is inherent that women are vain and even jealous of other women's appearance. It's not natural, but naturalized. So, yes, like going back to the math test thing, we can point at something that seems to demonstrate incontrovertibly a raw fact, but are there cultural forces that have affected this? I think that you will find that Gerald's text, now that you're aware of this paradigm, is fraught with examples where natural observations are read through a wishful cultural lens. So one class of those is, as I've suggested, looking at things that he sees in Ireland in terms of the quote-unquote lens of English dominion over it. So at the very beginning of his text, he says Ireland then lies parallel to Britain in such a way that if you sail to the west from any British port, you will meet Ireland at some point. So it seems as if it's like, oops, it just happened. We just bumped right into it. It was incontrovertible. It couldn't be helped. There it is right there for the taking. So, of course, conquest and territorial possession is much more complicated. It's happened via a pope, putting out a papal bull, latabiliter. It is most praiseful that I turned the wild Irish over to the English for safekeeping. So this is one of many passages where Gerald naturalizes British conquest of Ireland. Another one that is, so it's not the only other example, but in a completely different vein, he's looking at some fish. Here's the context. 2 years before the coming of the English to the island, there was found at Carlingford in Ulster a fish of unusual size and quality. Among other wonderful things about it was that it had 3 teeth of gold, about 50 ounces weight in all. It seemed to prefigure the imminent conquest of the country. So on that one, like with some of his other strange interpretations of natural phenomena, I can usually see why he says what he does, where he gets the message that he does out of a, albeit biased interpretation of a natural observation. There, I don't know why exactly, like there's a little bit of skip in the logic why the fish with the teeth would prefigure the conquest of the country. Perhaps that it is something unexpected and unusual, and it's also as I said, he's trying to describe Ireland as worthy of conquest, something attractive to the king. So the fact that even the fish have teeth, that are made out of gold suggests, yes, here's a land that the English would love to get their hands on. You will find that the line between nature and culture gets stymied and confused in Gerald's discussion of animal behavior. in particular when he imposes a religious moral on a natural observation about an animal. So this is not unusual in medieval literature. Nature is interpreted allegorically. I might say like a familiar analog for you guys would be something like Aesop's fables, where animals behave in a natural way. So like the tortoise and the hare races along, he gets kind of conceited, he sleeps under a tree, and thus the tortoise passes him. So the message there is slow and steady wins the race. So I don't know that animals would have enough, mental agency to think, okay, I want to win this race or lose this race. But nonetheless, here animal behavior is packaged up into a story that teaches a moral. So in a similar way, we see a lot of instances where Gerald is interpreting animal behavior in terms of a religious message. So these messages are made to seem as if they just grow up out of the natural world, when in fact they are cultural messages reverse engineered onto the natural world. So an example that I'm looking at here is regards the osprey. It's on page 43. So I don't know much about this animal. We're told that they enter and leave the water, controlling themselves by their swimming foot, but with their grasping foot, they catch and carry off their prey. So I guess it's like brake and gas pedal in the animal world. So whether this is true, this is just a natural observation. There's no judgment really here. But so interesting, so does our old enemy, which is always going to be the devil, see with his sharp glance whatever secret thing we do in the troubled waves of this world. So we are the prey who lives beneath the water, and it's like the devil, there's an idea that the devil is always ready to pounce if you are in a moment of temptation or deliberation. That's when he pounces on somebody who's unaware and perhaps susceptible to his charms. So does our old enemy see with his sharp glance whatever secret thing we do in the troubled waves of this world. And while with peaceful claw he approaches us airily through success and temporal things. So it's like, yeah, he's going to seem kind of chillaxed. He's not going to advertise the fact that he's the devil, so maybe even seem like a glittery and tempting thing. Still with grasping claw, bloody with his booty, meaning he's killed a bunch of other prey before he seizes and destroys our unhappy souls. So he's kind of quote unquote, two-faced. So here we have this animal's brake and gas pedal ability, his ambidextrous way, making his way through the world, surviving, swimming, and catching prey. And again, whether animals actually behave this way is a whole other story. But Gerald has interpreted it in terms of like the devil's two-faced nature, that he approaches us and in kind of an unsuspicious way, but he's ready to grab us with his bloody claw. So I promised you that I would talk about another binary pair after I got done with nature and culture, and this one is in fact related to nature and culture. So let me walk through what Gerald means about by natural world versus he'd probably say like an unnatural world or unnatural behavior. So let's first think about what natural implies. It's not so much nature versus artificial in the way that we have like the blueberries versus the blueberry muffin, or if you think flowers growing in the wild versus cut flowers in a vase. Or I always deliberate on Mother's Day, do I give my mom a plant or cut flowers? So the plant seems a little bit more natural and the cut flowers seem more cultural or artificial. I don't think that those two examples are all that relevant to Gerald. He means by natural more like a really, really pure and perfect idea of nature. So the Garden of Eden and God's creation. So yeah, people would be included in that. And yes, the natural world as we observe it. So much of what he's in fact describing in the text is circumscribed as both natural and then by definition, extraordinary. So if you think when a baby is born, people might say, oh, it's such a miracle, or life is such a miracle. This idea is latent in that congratulatory message. So even though nature is ordinary and it's unadorned and it's quote unquote not artificial, so I look out my window here in Bonneret Hall and I see, you know, beautiful trees one after the other, kind of ordinary. It is also extraordinary. We're on the most beautiful campus in the United States for one, but also it's created by God. And I could make a tree. I could make a blueberry muffin, but I can't make a blueberry. So there's a nice distinction for why nature, even though it's simpler, is actually more complicated. So recall what I said about binary categories. We set them up in order to confuse them. So in thinking about the natural world and how it relates to the category of miracles, we see a number of phenomena in Gerald's text that are unnatural in that it seems like the natural world has become unhinged. Things that you don't normally see occur in nature happen in this text. So I have a few examples here, and I'm sure you have many others. More accurately, they are supernatural and suggest divine influence. So if we think of the natural world as being evidence of God's creative powers and his presence in the medieval mindset, this is kind of like God's presence but supersized because it's extraordinary. So if I couldn't make a tree, I sure as heck could not make a talking tree. God can do that, and it reflects on his miraculous abilities. So here's an example. And into these, I was able to read a little moral, about like why these folk tales exist and why Gerald included them and what moral they might be expressing. So on page 61, we have there is an island in the sea west of Connacht that is said to have been consecrated by Saint Brendan. In the island, human corpses are not buried and do not putrefy, but are placed in the open and remain without corruption. So that is unusual to us. It's even unnatural. You would have to embalm such bodies to get that result today. You'd have to do something artificial to the natural thing, which is a corpse, or else a natural process will ensue. It will rot. What's the message that we're supposed to get out of this story? So why do we have this fable? I would say that these holy bodies suggest, like, they're extraordinary examples of physical resurrection of the dead that is allegedly promised to all people. So they're an exception that proves the rule. So we have lots of examples in the Middle Ages of saints' bodies not corrupting. In many churches, there's parts of saints' bodies that remain kind of intact or very intact over the centuries. So I don't know exactly how that manages to happen, but allegedly these perfect bodies that don't putrefy are supposed to suggest, yeah, even you can survive this mundane existence and somehow come out the other side after death and still be like, retain some of your personality, still be quote unquote yourself, Dr. Hayes. I hope everybody calls me Dr. Hayes in heaven. That would be a dream come true. Here is another example. I love this. This is a really long story about the wolf who talks with a priest, and it goes on at great length. The priest ultimately, to discover the person that he now suspects lives inside of the wolf, he pulls all the skin off of the she-wolf from the head down to the navel, folding it back with his paw as if it were a hand, and immediately the shape of an old woman, clear to be seen, appeared. So the bottom line here is that even animals, although they are mere beasts, like deep down, because they are part of God's creation, want to worship the Lord. And so we see this in a lot of Gerald's examples where you have natural things, behaving in extraordinary ways. There's this idea throughout the Middle Ages that even quote unquote like dumb beasts are aware of their creator. So a legend evolves in the wake of St. Francis of Assisi's career in the 13th century. It's out of his form of piety that we have the nativity tableau that includes the animals, and then there's an associated myth that animals get down at midnight on Christmas Eve to worship their creator. So I see this little legend in the same wheelhouse as that. In Gerald's text, what about extraordinary things that are not miraculous? So I have a pretty simple answer to that. Traditionally, the opposite of miracle is magic. So simply put, magic mimics divine activity. Miracles, which includes everything God does, it's very extraordinary. Just look at creation and nature to find evidence for that. And that's the basis for medieval theologians' condemnation of it, that magical things masquerade as divine activity, but in fact there's always some kind of sleight of hand. So I'm recalling the episode in the Bible with Simon Magus, who is pretending to divine power and getting challenged by Peter, if I'm correct. And one of his quote-unquote miracles includes resurrecting a dead body, but he doesn't really bring it back to life. He just makes it seem like it's alive by mimicking the signs of life. And so from this biblical figure, we allegedly get the word magic across many different languages. It looks similar to the English word. And so that's a nice crib for that idea. For Gerald, what's the opposite of miracles? So I don't know if he uses the word magic per se, and I would say that in this text that indeed it seems like a lot of things that you'd say, well, it doesn't really seem like a religious miracle per se, but indeed, if it's evidence of divine power, we're going to put it in the category of miracle, and that it's a holy thing, unless Gerald associates it with evil people, the devil, and then unnatural activity, which in this text is largely comprised of bestiality. So you have quite a few juicy stories in the middle of the reading that you did for today that involve bestiality. So a couple of examples here of a miracle, and then, as I call it, not miracle, so something that does not derive from God's creative activity. On the top there we have St. Kevin and the blackbird. The legend is described on page 78 of your text. St. Kevin goes away during Lent to get away from it all in order to have a contemplative retreat. He's praying and sticks his hands up toward heaven, raises one out of a window, and lo and behold, a bird spots this as a nice place to perch and even build a nest and lay her eggs, probably recognizing that he's a super holy person, even though she's just a bird. So Kevin is so sweet, he doesn't have the heart to evict the mama bird and the eggs, so he stays in that pose until they hatch, and thus we have images of St. Kevin commonly depicted holding a bird, as you see in this top picture, as well as on the cover of your text. So that's an extraordinary occurrence, and it still, involves things in the natural world. It's just like really hard to believe. The other example that I have there that I called not miracle involves one of Gerald's favorite types of quote-unquote unnatural behaviors. So it's when men and beasts combine in sexual activity. What we have there is this chappie here is the Oxman of Wicklow, who has human parts as well as animal parts. So it looks like he's got some hooves for hands and something like a human face. He stands upright. But as your text says at the top of page 74, the Irish natives of the place, because the youths of the castle often taunted them with begetting such beings on cows, so there we have a reference to bestiality, secretly killed him in the end in envy and malice, a fate which he did not deserve. So then the text goes into all different types of examples of bestial activity that does produce offspring, others that seem like they're just for lascivious pleasure, and all of those creatures and that activity fall into the category of not miraculous, even though they are, really extraordinary and strange. So, as I've said often, miracle is opposed to magic. Here, I would say in Gerald's text, it's miraculous or quote unquote unnatural, not miraculous. In the case of humans and animals, it's some kind of sexual bestial behavior, but we sometimes see the devil's influence in his text as well. So it's kind of like miracle and not miracle is the opposite category that I've come up with. But here's some next level thinking that I'll leave you with for next time and the rest of the semester and even life. A lesson about the Middle Ages. I called this lecture Miracles, Magic, and More Miracles because you'll find in medieval texts, remember what I said, that binary categories are fun because they get disrupted. Either the bottom term gets privileged, instead of the conventionally privileged term, so let's say man versus woman, or we have entities that inhabit the center between those two categories. Here I have miracles, magic, and more miracles. So you'll find that even evil people, the devil, and magic is under God's purview in medieval texts. So yes, activities may break divine law, but medieval writers often return to the idea that we can't have God not running a tight ship, as I say it there. So people might perform unholy acts, and the devil might even get loose and raise a bit of heck, but it's only because God allows them to do so. So the devil even sometimes is depicted as God's rod of correction, and you see him pop up a few times in Gerald's text as well, named the Old Enemy. And yeah, he's tempting people a few times, and we saw that in one of the examples I talked about today.